Hello once again. I wanted to record this over Zoom so that I could capture my screen and also speak to y'all through this video. So let's get right into the lesson for today. Alrighty. So again, I wanted to go over the Chicano movement and how the Latino civil rights movement to show how both of those movements overall influenced the art of the time period and influenced the culture surrounding the movements. So here we go. To preface the information, I wanted to break down my lesson into 4 parts. The first part being significant figures of the Chicano movement, and then the second part being the actual movement itself, and then the third part being significant art and culture and art, and then 4 being significant pieces. So the first half will serve more as a history lesson, while the second half will go more in depth about the art and the significance of culture. So let's start. What better way to start a presentation than with a quote? And the following quote is from Luis Valdez, and it reads, "No Statue of Liberty ever greeted our arrival in this country. We did not, in fact, come to the United States at all. The United States came to us." Luis Valdez is a famous Chicano playwright, writer, and director. He is most known for writing and directing La Bamba, which is an iconic film, not just confined to the Latinx community, but loved by people all over. As a playwright, he uses his voice for activism and wrote plays describing the Mexican-American experience. He is known as the father of Chicano theater as he started El Teatro Campesino, which is also known as the Farm Workers Theater, but we'll get more into that later. So I wanted to start this with, what exactly is a Chicano? Well, on paper, a Chicano is a person of Mexican origin or descent born in the United States. To Chicanos, being a Chicano is a chosen identity that rejects the assimilationist nature of Mexican American. The identity was widely accepted during the 1960s and 70s during the prime of the Latino civil rights movement as a whole. The idea of being a Chicano can be found in the following quote, which I'll first read in Spanish and then translate. Yo no soy mexicano, yo no soy gringo, yo no soy chicano, yo no soy gringo en USA y mexicano en México. Soy chicano en todas partes. No tengo que asimilarme a nada. Tengo mi propia historia. From Carlos Fuentes. In English, it reads, I'm not Mexican, I'm not white, I'm not Chicano, I am not white in the USA and Mexican in Mexico. I am Chicano everywhere. I do not need to assimilate, I have my own story. The Chicano identity came from the idea that being born of Mexican descent in the United States leads to a disconnect from both cultures because Chicanos are neither full Mexican nor full American. So let's get into some significant figures of the movement. So we have Cesar Chavez, who is a pretty famous name. He's pretty much associated with as the face of the Latino civil rights movement. And he's a union leader and labor organizer who dedicated his life to improving the treatment, pay, and working conditions for farm workers. And then we have Dolores Huerta, who is an activist and labor leader who co-founded what would become the United Farm Workers alongside Cesar Chavez. And she was actually the first woman to spearhead such a union. And so she is seen as kind of like a feminist icon, and she is kind of like the mother of the Chicana movement, which is using intersectionalist feminism to identify with the Chicano movement, but also uplift the voices of Chicanas, who are the women of the Chicano movement. So moving forward, we also have Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez. He's a boxer, poet, and activist who dedicated his life to fighting for Latino civil rights, more specifically in Colorado. And as we move forward with this lesson, you're definitely going to learn that the Chicano movement was different in all sorts of places. It was definitely a very regionalist kind of movement. It had different leaders in different areas of the country, and the influences and the ideals behind the Chicano movement definitely varied from place to place. So there's like no one grand movement. It's more of smaller movements for different regions, because different regions had different laws in place, and so different regions had different needs for the movement. So yeah, Let's move into more significant figures. Jose Angel Gutierrez, he was a professor and founding member of the Mexican-American Youth Organization and La Raza Unida Party. And then we have Mirta Vidal, who is a feminist who wrote in solidarity of the Chicano movement. She critiqued the Chicano movement and Anglo-feminism as an intersectionalist. So, like I said earlier, the Chicano movement, a lot of Chicanas didn't really identify with the such masculine voices of the Chicano movement, and Chicanas were kind of overlooked in the time period. So people commonly wrote about what it means to be a Chicana as a separate entity. So moving forward, we have Reyes Lopez Tijerina. Tijerina, yes. So he's labeled as the most controversial leader for the Chicano movement. He celebrated ancestral ties and denounced the American government. He argued for the land grants from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that the Mexican territory should be essentially handed back over to the Mexicans who were on the land in the first place. And so we'll get more into that later. So here we go, El Movimiento. Here are some of the issues addressed by the Chicano movement. They wanted the restoration of land grants, like Tijerina argued for. And then we also fought for farm workers' rights, like Cesar Chavez, enhanced education, like in some Supreme Court cases we'll see later, and voting and political rights. So yeah, the Chicano movement and the Latino civil rights movement really went hand in hand, but the Chicano movement was a very specific subset of that movement. The Chicano movement directly referred to the people who didn't identify with Mexicans and they didn't identify with Americans. They were kind of in between. They were the people that didn't have Mexico as a homeland, but the USA didn't feel like a home either. So it created this such unique identity was born out of this movement. So here we go. Let's go through some key events. First, we'll start with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War and ceded over 55% of Mexico's territory to the US, leaving many Mexicans in the newly acquired American territory. This directly contributed to the quote, which is used as a counterargument for most immigration issues nowadays. The quote reads, "We did not cross the border crossed us." So like I said, the Mexican land was ceded over, and there were many Mexicans that were just left in this new territory, and it was kind of like a political gray area that they were in, because yeah, they acquired the territory, but they couldn't just kick the Mexicans out. So really left a big gray area in terms of identity and culture for these people, because they were now a part of a whole new country. So moving forward, next is the formation of the League of United Latin American Citizens. The League's main mission then and now is to advance the economic condition, educational attainment, political influence, housing, wealth, and civil rights of the Hispanic population of the United States. Next is the Hernandez versus Texas case reaching the Supreme Court in 1954. The case is described as the first and only Mexican-American civil rights case heard and decided by the United States Supreme Court during the post-World War II period. In the case, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the 14th Amendment applied to all racial and ethnic groups facing discrimination, effectively broadening civil rights laws to include Hispanics and all other non-whites. In 1965, the United Farm Workers Association was formed by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Huerta was the first woman to lead such a union. The UFW joined the strike formed by Filipino grape pickers, and the grape boycott is described as one of the most significant social justice movements for farm workers. In 1968, Latino LA school youth performed citywide walkouts after facing discrimination in schools. Participants of the walkout were victims of police brutality and ridicule. However, the walkouts eventually led to increased college enrollment among Latino youth and education reforms throughout LA. So then the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund began and provided legal funding for the pursuit of protection for Latino civil rights. Finally, in 1974, the Southwest Voter Registration Project began and incited a surge in voter registration among Latinos. So, looking at these two puzzle pieces, they really go hand in hand for this movement, especially in regard to the art of this movement. So it formed an entirely new identity and culture surrounding Chicanos. Like they call themselves the people who were writing the dash, in a sense, the dash in Mexican American, because they were in a weird gray area between Mexican and American. Mexico wasn't their homeland, but America wasn't either. They may have been born in Mexico, but they may have been born in America, excuse me, but they still have those ties to Mexico. They still have those cultural and identity ties, but they're not widely accepted by Mexicans because they weren't born in Mexico. So this leads to a very interesting cultural fusion. The fusions between Mexican cultural identities and American cultural identities. And so there's also a very big difference between the Chicano and the Chicana. Chicanas are often overlooked, as most women in movements. And so in this case, the voices of those two are very different, but they're still fighting for the same cause, just in a different style, really. And so the Chicanas were often critiquing the Chicano movement for not being inclusive and intersectionalist, like we saw with some significant figures. And then there's the expression in art. There's activism, there's affirmation of culture, there's symbolism, there's muralism more specifically. And so all of these things are born from the identity and culture that came from this movement. So moving forward, we're going to go through 5 different pieces, and I'm going to be doing a live analysis of each piece. So I'm going to need to zoom in for this one. I'm going to zoom in. This one is called La Marcha por la Humanidad by Mario Gonzalez and Ruben Reina. It was made in 1973. It is a mural. So let's zoom in. Let's zoom in to see some key details here. So here we have an Uncle Sam costume, but he's portrayed not entirely in a good light. He seems to be like a skeleton almost. And so that could be representative of how Chicanos may have been born in America, but they don't identify with the American identity because they're seen as different because of their Mexican descent and origin. So again, this is a great representation of the gray area in between, because they're literally torn between this side, which is the Uncle Sam handing off barbed wire kind of American identity, and then the Mexican religious symbolism, poverty, impoverished areas, things like that. So yeah, this is definitely a big representation of those two identities. Let's move forward to the next one. Also, murals were a very famous portrayal of artwork during this time, because it was a really big statement to see paintings on the side of a building. It was a very big political statement as well, because when you have a city of people, you're not going to have the same political opinions with all of those people. There are going to be some people that don't agree with the message that see that mural, but they're going to have to see that mural because it's there, it's in your face, and it's on a building. So let's move forward. Here we go. It's called A Man with a Hat in Front of the World Trade Center Under Construction by Edgar de Evia. So it was in 1969. It's a photograph. Again, complete fusion of the two cultures. Here we have presumably a Chicano, and then the World Trade Center being like under construction. And so if you were to analyze this, it could be a representation of how immigrants are the backbone of this country. And so commonly immigrants are associated with working construction, working hard labor jobs such as like the grape picking and the strawberry picking and field laborers and things like that. And so being the backbone of this country, yet being discriminated against in the same country, creates a weird divide in your cultural identity, especially for Chicanos. So we have that. Next piece is another mural. It's called La Ofrenda by Reina Cervantes. And if you can see this middle person right here, that's actually Dolores. It was in 1989 and it's a mural. I've already said it's a mural. But yeah, you see a lot of symbolism here. Like you see a dark-skinned woman right here, presumably of an indigenous descent, sorry. And a big thing with the Chicano movement is that they celebrated indigenous ties, because the land that was taken by, not taken, kind of taken, I mean, technically won during the Mexican-American War, it was occupied by indigenous Americans. And so these indigenous Americans and indigenous Mexicans, they were kind of just left there in an entirely new country. And so the Chicanos celebrated their indigenous ties. So moving forward, you see a lot of writing, and then you see there's a worker here who's picking some of the plants. Direct callback to the farm workers, and then there's helicopters here, and then there's someone walking in water right here, which could be representative of the border. And then we have figures crying right here. Overall, very strong piece. Very strong in terms of symbolism. Like, it's just rich in looking at all of these different items and how they tie into the overall message of Chicano art. So, let's move forward. Next one, If La Virgen Returned, by Pablo Andres Christie. 2009, and it's a painting. So here we have our painting. And there's going to be a lot of Catholic imagery in Chicano art. And this Catholic imagery is a direct callback to colonization and the Spaniards bringing Roman Catholicism to Mexico to replace indigenous religions. And so the La Virgen, if you're not a member of Mexican culture, it's a very big symbol for Mexicans. Like, it's a very big symbol in terms of providing hope and a light at the end of the tunnel for suffering. And so that's essentially what religion is for a lot of people. Is religion is a symbol of hope. And so Mexican Americans and Mexicans really tie into that when facing discrimination. So, of course, we're going to have some religious imagery here in these paintings, because that's kind of like the motivator behind these civil rights movements. So, yeah, you can see a lot of presumably Mexican people looking at La Virgen, and has this glowing light around her, and it's a very iconic figure of her surrounded by light, standing on top of this child here. So let's move forward. Next we have Gateway to Manifest Destiny by East Los Street Scrapers, and it was made in 1982, and it's a mural. And again, this one is just rich with symbolism. As you can see here, it has a map right behind here, and on this map, it shows a lot of names in Spanish of the different parts of the country. And then we also have a man playing the trumpet, which music is a very big part of the cultural identity of Mexicans and Chicanos alike. Then we have a vaquero. So yeah, really big symbolism there. So yeah, and that's basically today's lesson. Thank you for joining me. It was just a quick little lesson about the Chicano movement and some of its influences on art. And yeah, I hope to see you guys in the next lesson. Thank you for joining me. Alrighty, bye-bye.
Hi, we are your IFA co-founders. I'm Ellie.
And I'm Miriam.
And thank you so much for watching our videos.
You guys can learn more about our cause down below at our website, www.inspirationfinearts.org.
And if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
We couldn't be where we are without the support of you guys, so make sure to send in videos of the things that you've learned during classes and pictures of the art that you completed.
Everything you send in will be featured on all our social media platforms.
Thanks for supporting us, and until next time,
go find your inspiration.